Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for attending this event, our professional and academic development series, PATS. This is our 32nd edition. As you know, the PATS is an event organized by the Emphasis in ELT Education of the Interinstitutional Doctoral Program and the research group EILA of our university, Universidad del Valle. Okay, so today I'm very pleased to introduce our friend and distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Raúl Alberto Mora. He has accepted this invitation to talk about his work, his research. I'm very happy and we are very honored to have you, Raúl, with us today. I'm going to go ahead and read Raúl's short biodata. I'm gonna read a little bit, but he's done a lot of stuff in his academic career. He is an associate professor at Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana. He's also a visiting faculty member in the interinstitutional doctoral program, especially here, the emphasis in ELT program. And at UPB, he directs the Literacies in Second Languages Project Research Group and is recognized as a senior researcher by MinCiencias in Colombia. His current research examines how second language literacies develop in urban and digital contexts, as well as the culture of video games, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So let's give him a warm welcome, Raúl, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Well, in my case, good evening, because it's almost 11 p.m. But I'm glad to be here. I'm always happy to come to Nivalle, come to the ELT program, to the ELT doctoral program to share whatever I'm working on at this particular point. Now I'm going to share my screen. Everybody good? Yes. So once again, thank you for the opportunity, not simply to present my research, but present the work that we are doing at the Literacy in Second Languages Project Lab. So this session, Researching the Unseen, Digital Ethnography, and the Construction of the Languages Victory Framework in ELT, is basically a journey through how we built this project. Of course, I'll be remiss not to recognize the ancestral lands that have welcomed this project, have welcomed LAV and the Legion, starting with Cali and Valle, in the ancestral lands of the Calamari, the Carec, the Bahaire, the Cuspica, the Yurbaco, and the legacy of the Afro-Colombian communities that have inhabited that area, recognizing that our lab is housed in Medellin, Antioquia, in the ancestral lands of the Embera, the Senu, and the Kunatule, and that tonight I'm broadcasting from Trondheim in Sur-Trondelag in Norway, which is part of the ancestral lands of the Sami peoples. It's important, even if we're talking about the digital era, it's important never to forget where we came from, never to forget our ancestry, and how that shapes what we do, who we are, and how we talk about it. The roadmap for this presentation, I'll have 5 points where first I'll kind of problematize the existing lore in video and gaming research, then why we created the new lore that we call Languages Victory, or LAV, how we updated the methodological considerations of the game elements, then I'll walk you through the quest itself, which was the research, and then a little bit of the sequels and the spin-offs that we are projecting in the aftermath of the work that we presented tonight. So to begin, let's begin just to question the existing lore regarding video games. And we found 2 unseens in line with the title. First of all, we noticed in the literature a lot of studies about gaming literacies that were coming from like the United States, some of the work of Jim G, Sandra Abrams, Hannah Gerber, John Reinhardt, Caris Jones, some of the work of Kathy Bies in Australia, some of the work of Carl Christian Hansen in Norway, Torrent Hanvoy in Denmark, some work on gamification, the work of McGonigal, Farber, Jesper Juhl, But in many of them, we're looking at short-term experiences. So one thing we noticed there, we needed more gaming research that looked at this longitudinally. So over time, over the years, over multiple genres, over the evolution. Then we had the problem with the gamers. So a lot of the gamers were participants of the studies with a narrow focus on games. So some of the popular franchises, and we stay there. But there was no research gamer integration. Gamers were simply data, not active designers. That got us to the second unseen, which is the global south. If you notice the first slide, I pointed out how the global north, and I include Australia in the global north, seems to overrule the research. And that goes into the traditional understanding of who gets to do research. In this case, not simply in terms of the geographical location, but also who gets to do it. Like, are we talking about research groups formalized in traditional institutions, credentials, etc.? And what we're proposing instead, and this is the push that a lot of us are doing in Colombia, is this idea that we're not just borrowing theory, but we're building theory from within. We're reconceptualizing at a grassroots level. So with those two things in mind, we started developing a project. And a little bit of the timeline, how we brought the unseen to the front. In line with the gaming motif, I picked a few quotes from the Mortal Kombat franchise to illustrate the journey. So we kind of started in 2013 when we started drafting the idea that we want to do research on video games. We started already doing research on the city. Let's look at video games. We officially started the first stage of the research project in 2014 when we also laid the foundations of the LAB framework I'm going to introduce later tonight. Around 2015, 2016, we had our first milestones, our first major conference presentations at Ethnography in Beijing in 2015, at the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry in 2015, our first conference at the Literacy Research Association conference in 2016. And in 2018, we had a watershed moment when we interviewed James Paul G for a book on gaming. And in talking to him about our research, he kind of like the interview itself inspired us to say, let's just work on a book that summarizes and brings together all this research. Around 2022, we finally had a proposal, we had a book contract, we started writing. With the pandemic and the relocation to Norway and everything, the process took a few years, a little longer than expected. But on December 22nd, 2025, we could declare victory, so to speak. And this volume, Understanding Second Language Users as Gamers, Languages Victory, was officially out. So what are we talking in this research? This idea of the new lore. This new lore goes into this concept we call language as victory, or LAV, hereafter. We started thinking of language as victory as how we make sense of the different interactions and the different ways gamers are using second languages, mainly English, but others that also emerge in the process, as a way to achieve the sense of victory and participate in the games and the gaming communities. And as we feature that right now, we think of this as a three-dimensional framework that we like to think of this trihedron, where we have different levels of interpretation that allow us to look at games within, but also across. So a lot of the research we do, interpretation talks about within the game, so looking deeply at one game or one franchise, and across, not only across genres, but also across time. And this is what the framework looks like today. So there are three key elements right here. So the first part is how we talk about language and how we talk about victory. When we say language, and we're talking about this intersection between the linguistic elements of language the spoken and the written word, all the semiotic element, all the signs, the symbols, um, this concept we call the isotypes, which are these permanent semiotic markers that we find across games, across franchises, across consoles, across um, different elements, and how they help establish this sense of continuity and identity in the process of, in this case, playing the game. And then the aesthetic, which is that connection, and we'll define these dimensions a little bit in more detail in for the slides that are coming later. So that's how we talk about language. Then when we talk about victory, we, as I said, we started with the idea of, oh, winning. Victory means winning the game. As the project progressed, some of the new gamers who came to the project, they said that it's not just the win the game, it's also how you find the commitment and the engagement to stick around for the long haul. So what is it that makes you stick around following a franchise like Call of Duty, or a franchise like Grand Theft Auto, or a franchise like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat over 5, 10, 20, 30 years? What is it about that makes you stick around and follow it for so long? That's the commitment that comes with that aesthetic experience, that connection to the text, and the combination with those linguistic and semiotic strategies that we talked about with finding language. All of that brings this idea of victory. Conceptually, we have a number of concepts that are supported over the years. The notion of multimodality as the integration of those different semiotic resources that we have, including the spoken word, the sound, the color, the motion, the animation, the vibration. The notion of isotype as these universal markers that provide a sense of situatedness vis-a-vis the games. The notion of super diversity as these cross-cultural phenomena that transcend the geographical boundaries and start moving into the digital boundaries. All the research on digital literacy and illiteracies over the years, all the tradition that sustains our work. And of course, this notion of polylanguaging and translanguaging as how people negotiate the presence of multiple languages and how they use those languages as resources, regardless of how competent or proficient, so to speak, they may be in that language. All these two ideas of language and victory and the concepts translate into this taxonomy. Taxonomy has 4 moments. One is LAV as learning, where it involves what resources you seek and how you begin to understand the game. But in understanding the game, language is involved. Then comes the networking. It's how you mobilize yourself across communities, across groups that are communicating, across the different groups that participate in the game, which moves into the playing. So what is it that you do when you're playing the game? Like before the game, during the game, after the game. And then that sense of that connection with the self that happens through the games. When we talk about LAV as identity, we will return in more detail to LAV as identity when we present some of the elements in the quest. So this is the framework we have right now. It's framework that is evolving. So this is just the 2026 version. But this is the one that we have right now. I don't know what new layers are going to come as a consequence of the research we're going to do later. I already have one of my undergrads proposing a potential 5th element to the taxonomy, and that's the only spoiler I'm going to give because it was just a brainstorming conversation we had as he was profiling his senior thesis. So it's just a conversation, a wild idea that it might materialize in another layer into this framework. So then we had to, okay, we're doing research on gaming. We think I need to take a second look at what we're doing. Here, I want to take a quick segue just to get a sip of my drink, but also to give a moment to introduce the stars of this project, the absolute stars of this project, the members of Team LAV, probably excluding the one with the crazy hair. These are the stars of the project. These are the gamers, hardcore, semi-professional, and professional, who have worked with me in designing the project and working on how we're going to collect the data, how we're going to analyze it, over some of them from the beginning, like the case of Tyrone. Some have been a little while longer in the project, like Carlos, Fletcher, Tatiana. Some that came in the middle of the process of writing, like it was Valentina, Jeff, Sebas, Parla, Camilo, Felipe, Carolyn, and Esteban, and some that came at the tail end, like Stewart, Andrea, Glaze, Alex, Andres, Valeria, Valentina, who just joined in some cases when we were working on the proofs, on the copy edits and the proofs, and some who came like a few weeks after we had submitted the book to the publisher. But they are all key elements, whether they started from the beginning or they joined a couple of months ago. This project, this research exists because they exist. And that's one thing I always like to be very clear, that this is not my research. This is our research. I'm just a very lucky mentor who gets to work with brilliant gamer researchers who are learning from me, learning with me, and I'm learning from them. So with that, when we decided to do the design, we said, let's go for broke. And there are two quotes we found as inspiration, one from video games, one from a qualitative methodologist, in this idea that, yeah, why not? Like, why not? I mean, as I said here, nothing is true, everything is permitted, from Assassin's Creed. And then, yeah, you can find the methodology and make it up. So with that inspiration, we decided to start rebuilding some elements of how we envisioned the research design. First of all, gamifying the research approach, gamifying the way we communicated with each other. So first, we gamify the team, thinking and using the expertise of the semi-professional and the professional gamers, saying, how do gaming teams operate? And how can we bring that particular sense of logistics into Team LAV? So we started thinking that there is the training, the game stages, the aftermath, there is the briefing, and then we started finding the analog, the similar elements of how you would build a research project. Then along this project, we also started thinking of roles that we had and how we used gaming terminology, specifically from massive multiplayer online role-playing games, FWMRPGs, and mobile online battle arenas, MOBA. We brought that terminology then into the writing process. So instead of saying lead author, second author, third author, fourth author, fifth author, because that made sense for me, but it didn't make sense for my gamers. So I decided, well, let's gamify the lingo and tell everybody your functions. If I tell my students you're the tank for this chapter, they know exactly what to do. Probably it takes me less time than how to say the lead author does this and that. I say you're the tank. They're like, got it, Commander. I know what to do. Exactly. And then we also decided to use similar language in the headings for the chapters. So instead of saying introduction or that, we said there's a prologue, set of levels, and an end game, which is vocabulary we found in fighting game. A lot of games will have story mode, have a story mode. That then it says it keeps the gamified element permanently as part of the conversation. And that brings us into this, how we started thinking how to use elements of ethnography to develop that sensitivity. How we bring that element of this multiple lives that are present in the gaming enterprise into the project. And we started, first of all, thinking how we use digital ethnography as that experience we have witnessed, we have observed. and then how we start using digital ethnography to understand communities and interactions and looking at the presence of these digital spaces in our lives. And the data that we represented through a lot of screenshots that we found and analyzed, YouTube and Twitch playthroughs, conversations with gamers. Just for the statistic here, as far as the I didn't mention in the slide, but as far as our data set, our research materials, we included in our research something over 50 video games. And we made references in our analysis from some of the classics. And I'm talking about classics. We talked about Pong. We talked about Atari 2600. We talked about Asteroids and Space Invaders and Missile Commander. And we talked about E.T. Then we talked about the Super Nintendo. And we talked about, later we talked about Sega. And we talked about PlayStation. We talked about PC games, and we cover multiple franchises. If anybody at some point would like to ask me, can we see that I have an incomplete list of the games that we cited and discussed in the volume. I'm happy to share that list with anybody who's interested in seeing exactly what games we talked about in the project. So that was the first element, is digital ethnography. Then there's a second element. We said we are bringing gamers to do research, but gamers also bring a lifetime of experience as gamers, a lifetime experience playing with consoles, building computers, choosing games, and then how we tap into that experience. So there is a lot of the personal accounts, or part of this, a lot of the screenshots they provided, how all, as I mentioned, there were over 50 games, and I think this book is has an incredibly comprehensive list of games. The only games, honestly, I brought to the table were the Atari and Mortal Kombat. Everything else, it's the suggestions my students proposed. If they told me I want to look at the entire Call of Duty collection, that's actually in chapter 6, Call of Duty. Or we talk about the whole Grand Theft Auto, or let's look at Blood Rain, let's look at Genshin Impact, let's look at Dota, let's look, whatever games they proposed were basically not off limits, because I trust their judgment that they're going to bring games that they can analyze and we can write about in a scholarly volume. So I trust my gamers' judgment and their choices of games, and a lot of the decisions in terms of gamifying come from the experience they bring to the table. And then there is a third layer, which is this idea of learned with, where ethnography provides the analytical lens. So when we talk about ethnography, I want to make a note, that's the term I'm using right now, and that's the term my partner, Dr. Golovati Namora, is using in her work as well. It is an expansion from the notion of do ethnography, and we have mentioned it in multiple outlets that we kind of took the idea of ethnography and ran with it after a conversation with Joe Norris in 2019 during the International Congress of Quantitative Inquiry, where he suggested the idea that ethnography probably gave us more possibilities for even to break from the traditional dual misunderstanding that some people had into ethnography. So I love the idea, and Pauline and I ran with it. And we talk about ethnography, where we push on the dialogic, and the ethnography being the dialogic and the dialectic in those exchanges of ideas. So there were a lot of conversations around the conceptual framework, the findings, conversations that we had in the last couple of years, mostly through our Discord server. So those conversations also provide different layers of analysis that made it to different sections of the book. But they also think about this idea of how LAV, the concept of LAV, fits into the notion of the interpretive zone that Wasser and Bressler proposed at the end of the century, the last century. and how we start creating an interpretive zone where we don't have those traditional hierarchies. Unfortunately, sometimes we still have to talk in terms of principal investigator, co-investigator, because, I mean, yeah, the document, some of the paperwork requires that. But inside LAV, we have a very Arthurian sense of operating where we are one team, we discuss, we share decisions, there is no unilateral decision making. And that is reflected in many ways in what we did with the book. And also reflected on this switch from a switch that LSLP has done for a while, from triangulation to polyangulation, and how we, in using notion of polyangulation, we move past some of the questions about the, let's say, the two-dimensional nature of triangulation into embracing the multiple realities and the multiple dimensions of analysis that exist, and that multiversal nature of research. So how we embrace those realities, how we embrace those dimensions as part of the conversation and the analysis we do, and how that gives us more layers and gives us the possibility of looking at this phenomenon from multiple angles, from multiple points of view to construct the reality, which leads us into moving away from the traditional idea used in qualitative inquiry of the Rashomon effect, based on the Kurosawa classic, into like, yeah, if I'm talking about video games, I cannot go and talk about Rashomon because Rashomon is like, it's A, it's from the 50s, and B, it's a movie. So I decided to go back into my source. My gaming people, I'm looking at games, I'm looking for a game that fits this characteristic, this, and that. By the way, they were already aware of this, they had read about Rashomon effect, so it wasn't that the notion was foreign. They had read about Rashomon effect, and Parla, one of my researchers, suggested the game called Disco Elysium. So we don't talk about in our team about the Rashomon effect, we talk about the Disco Elysium effect, in the sense that these video games, as in itself, these are Parla's words. I'm just going to try to read them almost verbatim because it's his words. It's this idea of the subjective nature of truth. There are no correct answers, but we have to look at multiple perspectives and shape the background, which again is as aligns with the central ambiguity of the Rashomon effect. So as we reconstruct this LAV framework and the findings for video games, there is a recognition of the multiple realities we have, the multiple identities, the multiple personalities that come into play, and how collectively we construct that framework and that vision we call LAV. So what have we learned so far? I want to talk tonight about the 4 dimensions of LAV that I outlined in the presentation of the conceptual framework: the linguistic, the semiotic, the aesthetic, and the identity dimension of LAV. So when we talk about the linguistic dimension of LAV, we're talking about the oral and written language and how spoken and written words are part of the game. And we noticed in our analysis that there is a technical language. So every video game has particular technical language that emerges primarily in English, but through the analysis of multiple genres, Spanish has been prevalent. We have found German, Russian, as depending on the game, as elements that appear. And you can see how some fighting games, Japanese and Korean begin to emerge as part of the technical language. Same goes with the language patterns. So the very specific lingo that players use in the interaction, and how that language leads to particular ways in which they communicate within the games. But there's also a lot of what happens as we are in these, as I like to call them, zero gravity spaces. There is also a lot of freestyling and how they start mixing the languages. There's the code mix and the code switching, and how that creates that every game begins to develop specific linguistic strategies to survive it and navigate it. And how that goes to show that in the middle of the game, the second language gamers are also making up language and making up expressions that may eventually make it to the non-digital spaces. Then we talk about the semiotic dimension and how images, colors, language, gestures, they connect to the concept, the perceptions, and past experiences. Here is where multimodality comes into play for the analysis. So we have, for example, in chapter 5 specifically looked a lot at Easter eggs and how Easter eggs become semiotic markers that help gamers situate themselves in the game and recognize more of the lore. And there are numerous examples of how pop culture references, how even the game designers themselves like to immerse themselves in the games by throwing the little Easter eggs that become popularized in popular culture. We talked about the evolution of controllers and how the haptic element of a controller, in that sense that some of the games vibrate, that becomes a semiotic marker that helps the gamers navigate. So these markers sometimes help find that balance between the linguistic and the linguistic element that sometimes is still developing. But as I'm aware of these of the vibration and the move and the motion, some of the contextual elements of the games and the symbology present in the games, as well as the isotypes. And we haven't talked enough about the value of the isotypes to create the gaming lore and to create this gaming identity. So I'll spend a couple of minutes going deeper into that, because isotypes become elements that help players navigate across the multiverse. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the examples we found was the controllers. So controllers, whether it's an Xbox or it's a PlayStation, they have those similarities that whether they use letters or symbols, the buttons have a same position and they have similar functions. And for example, when you're playing on a keyboard, when you're using your left hand, you want to use the same 4 letters: A, W, S, T, and then J, I, K, and L. Those are the A and the space bar. And even sometimes video. I'm literally looking at my laptop right now, and I can see my laptop has white keys for A, W, S, D. So it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter the brand. It can be an Asus. It can be a Lenovo Legion. It can be a ROG. It can be an MSI. It doesn't matter the brand. Those 4 letters become isotypes because they kind of distinguish that we're talking about games, or how certain characters become so ubiquitous to the game that they become almost universal, and you cannot think about that game without it. So, like, I always like to think, if you remove Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, that's not Mortal Kombat anymore. If you remove Mario and Luigi from the Super Mario Brothers franchise, there is no Super Mario Brothers anymore. Like, they're there. They need to be part of that. You cannot remove certain characters because, and what happens with those isotypes, if you remove the isotypes, you immediately change everything. And sometimes they have to retrofit in order to bring back the isotypes. The isotypes give a sense of you of this kind of grounded in that multiversal reality. And then goes also the secret locations that you found that give you particular clues in order to survive the game. When we talk about the aesthetic dimension, we're talking about narrative storytelling and history and how that develops a response. And when we think about response, you can theorize it in multiple ways. I usually like to theorize it from bringing together ideas from the transactional theory of Dewey, the notion of dialogism by Bakhtin, and real resource theory by Rosenblatt. This chapter uses a very different approach. But we talk about how the aesthetic dimension comes through some of the decision making you have to make in the game, and how messages, clues, and emotions help fuel those decisions. The historical background and the connection to the characters, to the settings, the situation. So how you connect to the game, how you connect to the historical background, And this particular chapter has a detailed discussion about Call of Duty and how Call of Duty, for example, really links itself to the historical background behind the different games. So you look at this historical event, you look at the decision making, these messages, the emotional element, and that develops that aesthetic dimension that you are reacting to the game. That you are, and as you are reacting through language. And as you're reacting, you are creating more language through the game. And then we have, the identity dimension. So when we think about identity, we talk about this idea of how we make choices of games, how we make choices of characters, how we make choices of different possessions, and how they align with our interests, how they align, even sometimes, as Jenkins talks about, this notion of moral realignment or moral alignment. So we make choices about the characters we play. And some of those choices are because, and I'll give you a very short example that it's not in the book, but it's part of the research we did. And was when I play Mortal Kombat, there are certain characters I never play with. Like Mortal Kombat 11 has the Joker, and I never play with Joker because I don't see myself aligning myself with Joker. Or with Shao Kahn, I don't play with Shao Kahn, the big baddie. But I tend to play a lot with Scorpion. I tend to play a lot with Johnny Cage. I tend to play a lot, even from the guest characters. I play a lot with Rambo, and I play with RoboCop. But I don't play much with the Terminator. So and we discussed, and we had a discussion about that. I said, and some said, yeah, but sometimes you just choose someone who doesn't reflect your values. So there is a sense of identity there that is also reflected. Again, as I said, character selection, how I customize the characters, how I engage myself in those communities, and there is a very interesting case study in that particular chapter where Tatiana, she talks about how her identity as a gamer mom, through gaming, she has developed a very special bond with her child. That is gaming, but it's language, and it's language learning, and it's practicing English, and it's layered. And how that gamer mom also begins to reflect in her other dimensions of life, which brings me into the next slide, where one of the things we talked about in this research was what's the effect of the framework, not simply as something we develop for our research project, but what happens when you have been not exposed to the framework, so to speak. That sounds like the Hulk, something like that. More like you have been helping build this framework for 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years. What happens to you as the consequence of playing with that framework? So at some point, what happens when you begin to embody LAV? And here are some examples. So Tatiana talks about how she was intrigued by it, and then eventually she started looking at the framework as a possibility to expand her own frameworks. Apollo, who's now he used to be a part of our team, but he made an appearance for this chapter. He talks about how even after leaving LAV, he still draws from what he learned in the team and what he learned from the framework as the basis for his teaching. Some of the others, like Parla, has found confidence in being part of LAV and building the framework. Some of them, they see that now they find that language and the game and the language they teach and the language they play are not isolated events, but they are deeply connected. And I think I want to really use that idea of this deeply connection between the language they play, the language they learn, and the language they teach, because that is going to be, I'm going to use that as a segue as I introduce the next, the part of the sequels and the spin-offs. So here is a past provocation from the chapter, with the interview we did with Jim G. And the members at the time, they talked about this idea of not being afraid to propose new approaches because we're fighting mighty enemies and we have to transform teaching. That provocation and what I said before about the embodied framework is gradually moving into one of the spin-offs, which is something we call the LAV Gamification Initiative. So the LAV Gamification Initiative begins from the idea that our gamers are moving into teaching. So this is not an abstraction. And how, interestingly enough, and this is what's interesting when I talked to my researchers about it, many of them came into the team with the perception that now that they were teachers, they would have to stop thinking as or being gamers altogether. A Faustian deal that we don't ask anyone else in our teacher education programs, overtly or covertly, to do. And we talked about that often. Right? No, you can be a gamer and be a language teacher. And in fact, being a gamer gives you other layers into language teaching that are interesting and are worth exploring. So we move on to this idea of the gamification initiative, where we move away from the traditional focus on certain elements of the games into using the gamer mindset. So we talk about, instead of saying gamer focus, instead of being game centric, where like the core of our work is the gamer ethos. It's how do gamers think? How do gamers strategize? And how can those gamers use that as teachable moments or as learning moments in the language classroom? But being very mindful that we are not seeking to further digital divides between or separate between gamers and non-gamers, but it's more about how we meet halfway through. Again, the same way LAV and I met halfway through. They bring the gaming, I bring the methodology, and together we build the cohesive unit. We still have questions because this is something that we're developing, but we have questions about how we balance gaming and other forms of engagement. The question about assessment begins to emerge. How the power structures are going to respond to something like this. So we start asking the question about striking that balance between the benefits and inclusion and critical engagement with the educational landscape. Those are questions we're still grappling with. So I'm not going to come here tonight and say, no, this is the next frontier of our work. This is what we're grappling with right now. We're grappling with how we're going to continue thinking about gamification. But also there's another question that permeates is, what else are we going to do with the LAV framework? What else are we going to do? And how we start thinking of this framework from a transcendent approach, again, drawing from some of the work of Arlette Willis, how we looked at that LAV. First of all, we place gamers at the core, the human dimensions at the core of this. How we think about the right to sustain commitment, right of victory. We think of this globally, and we think this idea of knowledge that is localized, is contextualized, and it keeps in mind the backgrounds and the histories. We have questions about the nexus between gamification, education, and society. What does that look like? What other spaces and communities should we visit, both digital and analog? We have been having conversations about, what's the next game we should analyze? Should we start looking at war games? Should we start looking at Dungeons and Dragons? Should we start looking at Warhammer? Should we start looking at the cultural comics, the cultural fandom, and the nexus between, video games and artificial intelligence? How that's going to shape up, and how we need to keep an eye on those questions, some of those conceptual issues, the practical applications, and the ethical dilemmas as video games and AI begin to start merging together. As I start wrapping up this presentation, and I talk about this idea of LAV for life, there is one reminder here, and this is one of the conclusions we had, is, look, finishing a game doesn't mean the journey is over. You finish the game, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that's going to happen. Something is going to happen. The game is going to respond. There's going to be a spin-off. There's going to be a sequel. There's going to be something else. Right now, we are in a phase of reloading. I think after the work we put together, we are giving ourselves a little bit of a breather to reload as we think about where the gamification initiative is going to go, as we start thinking about what we're going to do with LAB Beyond, and of course, taking some time to really celebrate and rejoice, because sometimes academia can be a very dry place where you don't have time to celebrate because you're supposed to be working on the next paper. You don't have time to rejoice because you're supposed to be writing the next one. And I think we have to bring back that joy. We are giving ourselves, we have taken, even these presentations are a moment of joy and pause, and a moment to celebrate the road as we plot the course ahead of us, understanding that this was a labor of love. This was work that it was 10 years in the making, and I would say 6 years, the whole book project. We started thinking the first thoughts in 2018. The pandemic and my move to Norway derailed some ideas, but in some moments we lost researchers, new researchers came in, we had turnaround, we had turmoil. So it was a flight with a lot of turbulence. Just if I use the aerial lingo, there was turbulence. But I guess as they tell you in the air, when you're flying, don't worry. It feels rocky, but the plane is not going down. And lucky for us, it didn't. Things that I want to leave you with as we finish this presentation: understanding that this layered approach of ethnography, especially for the doc students who are looking for ways to engage with methodology, a layered method of ethnography can be powerful. It gives you that kaleidoscopic. I'm kind of citing, using the words of Shirley Heath and Brian Street talking about ethnography, that kaleidoscopic nature of research. So it gives you a kaleidoscope to play with. Listen to your gamers, listen to your students. Listen to them carefully when you are working on those teacher education programs. This project did not come as the result of a multi-million dollar research project funded by blah blah blah, or the research foundation by Horizon or Spencer or the National Science Foundation, or no. This was grassroots. This was grassroots through and through, organic through and through. So I say, listen to your students, because you never know what LAVs are hiding in your schools. You don't know what LAVs are hiding in plain sight in your schools of education, in your undergraduate programs, in your master's programs, because we're not listening. And final advice is build a team, build a community first. Build, as we did in our case, build a legion, and then plot everything else. Plot the next paper, plot the next presentation, plot the second book, plot the third book. But without plotting the community, without plotting the team, we have to ask ourselves then, what's the whole point of this? And with that, one final parting thought, summarized in our collective commitment as a team to education, research, and life in our motto, when we say we play together, we win together, we die together, Team LAV for life. And on that note, I want to express my gratitude to everybody who was listening to the presentation tonight. That is my contact information, my email, and my Instagram. If you want to learn more about LSLP, you can just use our link bio to check our Instagram, our TikTok, check our website, learn a little more about us. And I always like to make the fun little light comment where that you can never go wrong if you put your dogs in the final slide. People love that, and I always take my moment to introduce two key elements of the research project, which are Connor McLeod and Duncan McLeod, our doggos. So with that, once again, my gratitude for giving us the space, giving us, because I'm just representing a team. I'm not speaking on my behalf. I'm speaking on my own. I'm representing LAV. I'm representing LSLP. I'm just the one who sometimes has the opportunity to grab the microphone and bring the voice to the rest of the collective. So on that, thank you very much. And I think we may have some time for a little bit of conversation, Jose.
Yes, Raúl, thank you very much for this very interesting research project and languages victory project. Um, I think there's many things we can talk about, and I would like to open the floor for the attendees and also this, especially the students of the program who are taking their research course, and see what questions they have, or the audience. You feel free to open up the mics and speak, or also you, if you want, you can write your questions on the chat box.
Ademar, Juliet wants to ask the question. Yeah, go closer. Can you listen to me?
Yeah, I can listen to you. It's very blurry.
Oh,
That is not my glasses betraying me. It's that it's okay. So yeah, what's up? Hi. What's the question?
oh, thank you for sharing this beautiful experience. I think it has lots of elements that actually call really my attention. They are multimodality and aesthetics and all the elements that you're considering into your project, into this experience are like very interesting, and they I think they contribute to different spheres of our the development as a students, and also as users of a language, of course, and to our comprehension of research too. And something that caught my attention was the sense of community. And even more than seeing it, because I saw it reflected in everything that you were saying, I also feel it, how you were developing that sense of community. But when you mentioned that the students, or that they were having conversations, the participants were having conversations with gamers outside of the group, let's say, yeah, I wondered about I wonder about the criteria, or how did you, if there was any control or any specific requirements or conditions in which these interactions were held, and how did it develop, and how do you think it influenced what you were doing in the project? Because it's really, for me, let's say, gamers, like the community of gamers is kind of tight, but at the same very welcoming, you know?
Yes, it is both. Yeah, yeah. So what happened in these conversations is, okay, we didn't necessarily, like most of let me just clarify the answer. We held those conversations in order for us to make decisions about what we could do, and we spent a lot of time in some of those conversations, including talking to people who were recording those game throughs and gameplays on YouTube. So some of them were people, and they'd say, let's look at this channel, or let's look at this person, and then we would contact them, and we would ask for permission to take the screenshots. We didn't conduct any interviews, so it was more like, okay, let's see what you know from that, and then bring the screenshots, bring the information, and then some of the other party was what the gamers themselves brought. I've had, I think, over the years, somewhere at least over 20 or 25 researchers part of LAV since the beginning. That has left us a lot of information about multiple games. So we had been collecting information about these games and watching our gamers do this work for 10 years. So even if we have to go and look for people outside, it was more people give us a little bit of perspective. But we already had a lot of the data. We had already had it for over a decade, and then we just kind of, as we were working on the recent iterations, we were updating some of the information, and then as we had information, we were bringing more of that. But in general, I trusted. One of the things I thought was important here is I trusted my researchers' judgment. I I trust their judgment because they're the ones who have they have logged in thousands of hours playing games.
Oh, right.
I have to honor that wealth and kind of guide it and harness it. And yes, the community building is it's it's vital for what we do. In general, in the larger lab in LSLP, but the specific LAV, um, we mentioned in the book, and I always say I've been calling them for a while. I always call them I was my brothers in arms. Then when we had the female gamers, now it's my brothers and sisters in arms. But I always like to call them that in the sense that we like to think that as long as we're within LAV, we're this brotherhood. We take care of each other. We kind of go with the same basic rules of we kind of go with these basic rules of playing team games. It is like basically a simple question of I always ask the question: what happens if one of you logs off in the middle of in the middle of a quest, in the middle of a battle? And everybody's got, well, the rest of us we're gonna die. Exactly. If one of you logs out of nowhere, the rest of us are doomed. So we always have to make sure that we stick together. Everybody comes home. We leave nobody behind. But it's not simply the research. It's also the human factor. If I'm not taking care of the human factor, especially when I'm working with very young researchers, the other factor is going to falter. Because as we mentioned in different parts of the book and our work, we dealt with a lot of stuff. We dealt with students having mental breakdowns, having burnout, getting sick. We lost researchers for multiple reasons: life, mobility, migration, marriage, graduation, you name it. But the community building, that was basically what held us together and what allowed us to finish this project, because there were moments that we had questions. I mean, are we ever going to? Are we really going to finish this? We had. I mean, we asked ourselves the question, and then we picked ourselves up and continued writing. But that community element was what allowed us to continue, and what is allowing us to now think of life after this larger chunk of the research that we presented.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
Hey, Raúl, how's it going?
It's going all right. Going
Can you
awesome.
see me?
Well, I can. Yeah, I can see you.
Oh,
I can.
Super interesting projects. Pretty complex, really, for what I saw. What caught my attention most was when you started your presentation talking about lore. And I don't know if you could expand on that a little bit and how you use the idea of lore and sort of this sort of background knowledge in these fictional worlds, but how you kind of incorporated that into different territories that you mentioned, like Valle Cauca, and where you are now.
Yeah, happy to talk about it. I mean, yeah. So the notion of lore has been circulating around LAV for quite some time. And I want to give a shout out to Julian, who's been kind of the person who has not only given us his professional gamer insight, which has been crucial for a lot of the decisions I've had to make in the project as kind of like leading this gang, but he has really given us a very good understanding of the notion of lore. So when we talk about the lore in a game, we talk about all these background, all these elements that are part of the background that help construct the story. So when I'm talking about lore in this context of game is, first of all, looking at what, again, we started with, okay, what has been said? And that part of the building that lore came as a consequence of building the project. So I started the project thinking it would be really nice to do research on video games. It's just that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I just kind of like, and I think I wrote it in chapter 1 that I was writing. I was sitting down somewhere at the university. I was writing some lesson plan for a class while I was waiting for my wife to finish her class at the UPB. I saw 2 of my students in the undergrad program, and I asked if they play video games, and they said yes. And I said, I'll call you later, and that's how it started. But as I started working with the gamers, I started realizing, as the consequence of also having conversations with other gamer scholars and reading some of the other work, that part of the lore was using the gamers in many ways. In many ways, some of the gamers were secondary characters. In some places, they were NPCs. But they were not the ones driving the story. So we were building that gaming research lore in many places without the gamers, because there were very few. I mean, it's gotten better because a few more people have come into gaming as gamers. So I'm thinking right now of a couple of friends of mine, Antero Garcia, started playing board games. Roberto the Rook, he's a gamer. But others became gamers as a consequence of doing this. So in that sense, when I'm thinking about the idea of, first of all, questioning the lore, it's okay, how are gamers portrayed in this narrative? What is the positionality vis-a-vis the research? And that's when I said, well, how about we redefine the lore where we can have gamers helping drive the narrative, so that I'm not the one deciding I want to look at people playing LOL or World of Warcraft, but more they're the ones telling me, Raúl, if we're going to talk about the semiotic dimension, this is one of the games we want to look at. Or if we want to talk about the analysis, this is the game we want to look at. That gives the project a whole different and a way to reconstruct that lore, as in what's driving the narrative. There is another part of where lore comes into play, and it has helped us a lot. It's how we are thinking about gamification. So when one of the first ideas we have outlined about gamification has to do with looking at the lore in the games as a way to introduce the students to language, and also the game elements that are present in these spaces, and how they can also become elements within a pedagogical experience. So lore has helped us build a narrative, but also giving us a clue as to how we can talk about gamifying and moving away from some of the traditional understanding of gamification we have today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. I think we're reached the end of today's paths, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Raúl for sharing your work. Very interesting. I think your presentation is very informative and introduce us to a different way of doing research, right? Because the idea we have here is welcoming all types of research, all types of ways of addressing epistemological tendencies. And I think that this Language is a Victory project is a good invitation to reflect on how L2 users engage in gaming as complex, multimodal, and I think identity-rich practices, right? How language becomes a powerful resource for achieving success in these environments. Not only for the game, but as you say, in all dimensions of life, as researchers, as language learners, and in their own lives, since gaming is embodied, as you say. So that's great. Raúl, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. On behalf of everybody at AV, thank you for the forum. Thank you for the opportunity to exchange ideas and give us more stuff to think about as we are thinking of the next step, the next frontier for our work.
And I also want to thank members of the audience, and I also want to invite people to our next PATS, which is in May. And we're gonna have another stellar guest, which is Dr. Fred Durbin from the University of Helsinki. We will be sending you information about it. And as usual, could you guys, the ones who are still online, could you open your camera so we can take a screenshot for our social media? All right, guys. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.